So Conor McGregor's been a busy man. In between losing a civil case in which he was found by a jury to have raped a woman in 2018 and then losing a High Court appeal on this charge, he's found time to announce himself as candidate for the Irish presidency. Unfortunately, he's not actually found time to even read the Wikipedia entry on what the powers of the presidency are. In this video, I'll break down the role of the Irish presidency and explain why, despite Conor McGregor's wish to be an Irish Trump, the Irish president cannot do the things he thinks he can. But despite this, while some people do like to compare the Irish presidency to the ceremonial British monarchy, the Irish president's powers and democratic mandate mean that a McGregor presidency could still cause a lot of trouble. In several tweets, retired MMA fighter, whiskey distributor and general attention seeker Conor McGregor expressed his intention in running for the Irish presidency. But in these tweets he also seemed completely clueless as to what the Irish president can actually do. He seems to think that the Irish presidency has the power to control our borders, end immigration, change the country's planning laws, opt out of EU laws, and just generally use the Irish presidency to implement a far-right agenda. So essentially Conor McGregor seems to think that the Irish president has similar powers to the US president, that the Irish president exercises what we call executive power. However, a quick read of the Irish constitution shows that the Irish president does not exercise executive power. Article 28 of the constitution states that the executive power of the state shall, subject to the provisions of this constitution, be exercised by or on the authority of the government. Who are the government and who is the head of this government? Well, Article 28.5.1 states that the head of the government or Prime Minister shall be called, and in this constitution is referred to as the Taoiseach. And while 28.1 does state that the government shall consist of not less than 7 and not more than 15 members who shall be appointed by the President, we need to be very careful about what this actually means. Yes, the constitution mentions that the Taoiseach and the government is appointed by the President, but Article 13.1 makes it clear that the President shall, on the nomination of Dáil Éireann, appoint the Taoiseach. So in reality, it's the Dáil, Ireland's lower house, in its legislature that actually nominates the Taoiseach, and it's the Taoiseach then who picks the other ministers. The president role in government formation is purely ceremonial, much like that of the British King. The Irish constitution does appear to vest several powers in the president, but Article 13.9 makes it clear that the powers and functions conferred on the president by this constitution shall be exercisable and performable by him only on the advice of the government, save where it is provided by this constitution that he shall act in his absolute discretion Essentially what this means is that the president doesn't actually have discretion in how they exercise the vast majority of these powers. Again, this is similar to the British King who, in theory, possesses powers such as entering into treaties, appointing government ministers and directing armed forces, but in reality these powers are exercised by the government. The Irish president therefore only has discretion in the very narrow areas where the constitution states that the president shall act in his absolute discretion. So really, the Irish president does not exercise executive power, unlike the US president. Indeed, the constitution is clear that the Irish president is actually part of its legislature, but the president only has a very limited role in terms of the legislative process. They have no input into the design of legislation. Instead, their role is to sign the legislation into law. Also, the president cannot veto legislation, but they do have one power in this area, and this is perhaps the most powerful legal power that the Irish president has. Article 26 of the Constitution allows the president to refer bills to the Supreme Court to test their constitutionality. You can think of this as a power to temporarily delay legislation for a maximum period of 60 days while the Supreme Court assesses its constitutionality. The bill does not become law until after the Supreme Court decides whether it's constitutional or not. And if the Supreme Court says that it's unconstitutional, the president cannot sign the legislation and it cannot become law. But in reality, this power is exercised very rarely. Why? Well, because Article 34.3.3 states that no court whatever shall have jurisdiction to question the validity of a law or any provision of a law, the bill for which should have been referred to the Supreme Court by the President under Article 26 of the Constitution. So what this means is that if the President refers a bill to the Supreme Court under Article 26 and the Supreme Court finds it constitutional, then this bill becomes law and the constitutionality of this law can never be challenged again. So what tends to happen is that even if the President thinks a law could be unconstitutional, they will sign it into law anyway, enabling courts to review its constitutionality in the usual way. An Article 26 reference is really the key constitutional power that the President has, but even then they exercise that power very rarely. The President also has a role in whether to call a general election in the event that the Taoiseach loses the support of the Dáil. When this happens, the Taoiseach will go to the President to resign and ask them to call a general election. However, the President can refuse to do so if they think that another government can be formed without the need for a general election. So, for example, when the Fianna Fáil Labour coalition collapsed in 1994, a general election wasn't held. Instead, a new rainbow coalition was formed of Labour, Fine Gael and Democratic Left. However, even in this situation, the President did not exercise their power to refuse a general election, as the outgoing Taoiseach, Albert Reynolds, did not request a general election. Why? Because there was a belief that a new government could be formed without one. What this means is that this power of the President has never been exercised. There is also another power where the President can call a referendum on certain types of legislation if requested by a majority of members of the Seanad. But again, this power has never been exercised. So the Irish President therefore is a largely ceremonial role with a limited ability to delay legislation and a limited role in government formation. But this is not to say that the role cannot be political. And here is where the comparisons with the British monarchy break down. King Charles's legitimacy is almost completely dependent on the fact that the role is non-political. Why? Because he's unelected. And if the king or the monarch were to exercise political power or intervene in politics, this could raise questions about democratic accountability and undermine the monarchy's legitimacy. In contrast, the Irish President is directly elected by the Irish people and accountable to the Irish people. Their legitimacy is based on democracy, not tradition or on the belief that they were appointed by God. This means that their legitimacy is not necessarily undermined by them speaking out. And while the Constitution does place some constraints on certain types of speeches that the President can give, for example formal addresses to the Oireachtas or an address to the nation, these constraints do not necessarily apply to every speech they make. Since Mary Robinson, Irish presidents have been more vocal in expressing their opinions and often getting criticised for doing so. Michael Higgins in particular has been criticised by some for weighing in on Ireland's abortion debate following the death of Savita Halappanavar, or criticising austerity and neoliberal economics in an address to the European Parliament. And it is here that a McGregor presidency could cause some disruption. Although the president doesn't have the power to control our borders or end immigration, they can certainly exercise soft power and voice their opinions on these issues, raising their importance in political discourse and potentially discrediting or undermining government action in these areas. But crucially, the president cannot stop the wheels of government turning. But a president perhaps could also cause disruption to the legislative process by abusing their power under Article 26 and referring all bills that come across their desk to the Supreme Court. Again, this could only delay a bill for 60 days, but the resource pressures that this would place on the Supreme Court and on lawyers tasked with arguing these cases could be considerable. And Article 26 references have been controversial in the past. In 1976, for example, Carol O'Dowley resigned after the Supreme Court found the Emergency Powers Bill 1976 to be constitutional. The Minister for Defence, Paddy Donegan, called the President a thundering disgrace for doing so. Apparently he actually used much stronger language than this. Anyway, O'Dowley felt that he had no choice but to resign. So there you have it. The Irish President is not like the US President. They don't exercise executive power. They are more like the British King. However, they're democratically elected, and so this gives them greater legitimacy to speak out. The President really exercises soft power, but soft power does not necessarily mean weak power. And this soft power can exercise considerable influence in shaping national discourse and even challenging government policy. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up, and if you would like more content like this, then please do like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.